Hello, and welcome to Lafayette We Are Here, a French history podcast for the American public. I am your host, Emmanuel Dubois, and today we have a special episode. This episode is in direct continuation of our last show on the French Enlightenment. If you have not already done so, I encourage you to listen to it beforehand. Last time, I mentioned that the Enlightenment was not only a French thing, it was present all over Europe. A perfect example of that is the French writer and philosopher Voltaire. He lived a good portion of his long life outside of France to spread and discuss ideas. From 1750 to 1753, he lived in Berlin at the court of Prussia, invited by the Prussian King Frederic II, known as Frederick the Great. But this is a special episode, isn't it? So instead of me doing my usual presentation, we have an interview with someone way more knowledgeable than me on Prussia, Alec Avdakov, from the podcast The Life and Times of Frederick the Great. So, without further ado, here is the interview I conducted with him. So, to discuss the famous French writer Voltaire and the Enlightenment in Europe, I am thrilled to have on the show Alec Avdakov from the podcast The Life and Times of Frederick the Great. So, Alec, please tell us more about who you are and your podcast.
So, obviously, my name is Alec Avdakov, and I'm the creator of The Life and Times of Frederick the Great. Essentially, I created this podcast to talk about not only just the biography of an insanely important figure in history, but also just to talk about different aspects of history in the 1700s that overall is an overlooked period in history. I would consider the age of the Enlightenment to be an extremely important time, and honestly, I consider my podcast to be a context towards why the French Revolution happened, and specifically through a Prussian lens. So, what is Prussia is another can of worms that I just raised. So, yeah. So Frederick the Great, he was the king in Prussia at first, and then king of Prussia. So Prussia is not just the pretty part of Russia. No, Prussia is a German-speaking kingdom that was in what's modern-day Berlin, and also in parts of now in Poland, and essentially it was a part of. So here's how I like to visualize Germany back then. It would be if every state of the United States was independent, but somehow all aligned by an emperor in the middle. So, say if New York City was independent, if Ohio was independent, if California was independent, and all of these somehow were aligned together. And I would consider that Frederick the Great was important in staking Prussia's claim to become a great power in Europe. See, Prussia was just this little poor nation known as Brandenburg, and that became the Kingdom of Prussia. And essentially, Frederick the Great took that sandy little poor nation to become one of the big boys in Europe. And back then, the great powers were the dictators of Europe. It still kind of is that today, if I'm not wrong. So, great powers of Europe, and that system is like a boiling pot. You have some like potatoes rise to the top, and others falling down.
Yeah.
So during this time, Sweden and Spain were falling down while Prussia was on the rise.
Yeah.
And Prussia had the military. See, Frederick Wilhelm, who was Frederick's father, did two things that were important for Prussia to become a great power. One, he created the modern bureaucracy that basically made the stereotype of efficient Germans. And the second thing is that he created a very powerful army, like disproportionately large army, like fourth largest in Europe by the time he died. And Frederick the Great used his army to, become great.
Yeah, that's like if you ask a Frenchman from that era, that's probably what they would tell you that Prussia. I mean, we have a telling. It's paraphrasing, but basically saying that Prussia is not a state with an army; it's an army with a state.
Yeah.
That's how it was perceived outside of this country, and still today, like if you were asking your average guy that knows about Prussia, the image he would have would probably be of a militaristic country.
Yeah. No, I mean, the kings, starting with Frederick's father, wore military uniforms instead of the classic king robes and the crowns. No, they wore military uniforms.
Yeah,
And
it's funny when you tell that story about his father setting the way. Like it's so it reminds me so much of Alexander the Great,
yeah,
that had his father Philip set up Macedonia in the way that it was with a great military, great administration, and of course his kid Alexander was who he was, a great man. But still, if his father didn't do the setup before him, he would be completely unknown.
yeah, that's a perfect analogy. I wouldn't have figured that one out, but so thank you for that. So, yeah, Frederick the Great, without his father, would not be the Great. Um, he would just be some guy who you would consider homosexual now, and he wouldn't be he would be a nobody.
Some part. Can you, for the benefit of the listeners, give us his dates? Like when did he live exactly?
Right, of course. So Frederick the Great was born in 1712, became king in 1740, and died in 1786. So he was around. He was a king in Europe for 46 years, and that's a really long time. Not
Yes.
not compared to like obviously Louis the 14th, but that's an insane
Yeah,
rule.
he has the record. So, but still, 46 years as a king is a very long time. You
Oh
can
yeah, for
you
sure.
can achieve a lot, or you can mess up a lot depending on who you are. But he certainly achieved a lot, and
Oh,
it's
he actually did both.
yeah.
That's the thing. That's the thing about Frederick the Great. You can't really categorize him, and that's what I love about him. Uh, see, but the great thing about unity of command, like command under one person, you can either do amazing things, have efficiency, do so many things, and also screw so many things up.
Of course, like any dictatorship. So we're gonna talk about Voltaire and his link to the Prussian king
Right.
in the global perspective of the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment is not a French thing; it's a European movement. It actually started more in England than anywhere else, and the English writers and thinkers influenced the French a lot, including Voltaire, who lived in England for a few years. Um, and how does this French writer, atheist, who is known to be a very good writer and very, how can I put it? He likes to disturb. I mean, he ended up in prison a few times in French. He was at the Bastille a few times because he criticized the king or didn't say only good things about him, even though he was himself of a good family. I mean, he was the son of a notary who worked for the highest French nobles, and he liked the high society. That man was rich. He despised poor people. I mean, don't take Voltaire for like your lefty guy. No, no, no. He is not. I mean, some people in France like to say he was the first real man from the left because he would be living among those rich men. He would in public, criticized, but
Yeah.
in private, he would just live in castles. So, how does this guy in the mid 18th century, this Frenchman, end up at the Prussian court of Frederick?
So, ironically, we're actually going to have to go all the way back to Louis XIV. I have a quote that I wrote that I didn't write. Obviously, I didn't write this. Goodness gracious. No. So I got a quote from Tim Blanning's book, Frederick the Great. Best biography I have for learning about Frederick the Great. So during the time of Louis XIV, a diplomat could say, "Not a dog barks in Europe unless our king says he may." So France, big honcho for culture, for art, for the military during Louis XIV's reign. And that disturbance in the European balance of power is what basically splurged French culture all over the nobility in Europe. And this goes into how Frederick was brought up. So Frederick the Great, he did not have a good childhood at all. Frederick Wilhelm, who was his father, abused him. He basically set him up for education and as a mirror of himself. So Frederick the Great secretly created a library of everything his father hated. He loved French culture. Frederick loved French culture. He wore out his hair long and styled himself as a Frenchman, a noble Frenchman. And actually, Frederick the Great almost entirely wrote in French. He spoke in French. Frederick the Great loved French culture. And in fact, in one of his secret libraries, he had one of Voltaire's histories of Charles XII, who was a very famous Swedish king. And Voltaire was his hero. Like any of the TikTok stars wouldn't come close to how obsessed Frederick was with Voltaire. So he started up a correspondence, Frederick did, with Voltaire in 1736, 4 years before he became king. And from that, he started a whole bunch of letters that could basically contain 4 volumes of huge, gigantic books between Voltaire and Frederick the Great. And from that first correspondence, they eventually met. There was one story that I got from a biography of Voltaire that Frederick the Great had the flu when he first visited Voltaire. And when Voltaire entered the room, and mind you, Frederick the Great, this was his first year as king. He was just a small man laying in bed. Frederick the Great, just a sick guy. And he didn't have the pomp and circumstances like Louis XIV had. He was not the Sun King. He hated titles. He was just a man talking to another man. And that is how Voltaire started talking with him in person.
Interesting. So you saw him as a man to interact with, not especially a king to bow before.
Exactly, yes. So eventually, throughout the 1740s, the War of Austrian Succession happened, which is another can of worms that I honestly can't get into. But no, I'd say that there was Voltaire. He had a mistress, Madame Châtelet, and she was very important to his life, very scientific, and she ended up dying with his child. And after that, Voltaire obviously grieved, and by that point, he had nowhere truly to go except for Prussia. So Frederick, obviously, basically hero worshipping Voltaire, he had open invitation to Voltaire at all times. And in 1750, I do believe, 1750, Voltaire moved to Berlin. So he moved to the capital of Prussia. And this was not the first time that Voltaire was out of his country. In the 1720s, he moved to England, and he wrote very many famous plays there. And he basically thought that England was the land of liberty.
Yes, the English literature and way of thinking was so important to him. And the advancements made in England at the time. I mean, as I said, the Enlightenment takes its roots in England more, to me, more than any other country. Then it expanded and probably grew in France more than anywhere else. But still, the English rule, like you have Locke,
John Locke,
yeah,
absolutely.
and even the writings of, you were mentioning Madame du Châtelet. She's the one who translated Newton in French, and because she was a scientist, and all the understanding of the word reasoning, all that stuff is so crucial to the Enlightenment. And to me, that's key also with what you're saying about Frederick, because when he was a one of a kind king at the time, like if you take the French king, he's ordained by God, and he derives his power from believing in God. And he doesn't I mean, they're not stupid guys, but he doesn't have to use the same tools as Frederick. Frederick, as you said, is from a completely different country with a different way of running. They're the new kid on the block. They're trying to, be there in Europe where you have France, which is, I don't know how many times bigger, stronger, more people, richer, what have you, and established. I mean, France have been a kingdom for over a thousand years at this point.
And Prussia was only just a kingdom just at the turn of the century.
Exactly. So they're the new guys, and you have this incredible intellectual movement. I mean, I don't think even the Renaissance is not as quick as the Enlightenment, because and the consequences are so extreme. Like I think it's in 1762 that you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau saying that we are entering the age of revolutions, plural. And he was just, a bit over 20 years ahead of himself, but he was right. He figured that those systems, the traditional regimes, could not carry on forever with this new way of thinking, of looking at things.
I mean, if you consider how backwards feudalism was, and it was still being practiced within the heyday of the 17th century.
Yes, and what I find interesting also that way that the Frederick the Great had of having that open invitation to Voltaire, just whenever you feel like it, come home. I'll welcome you. We can talk, and Frederick is also considered a philosopher king, right?
Yeah.
And because he was he was an intellectual, basically, and which is not that common for kings. Not at all. They often,
if you consider how his father was just basically just this glunk of a guy who just only military, do not spend it all, and despise anything that is not masculine.
Exactly, just a state's functionary on the highest level. Don't think too much. Do the things.
Yes.
And so, and it's a double-edged sword, because having a guy that overthinks can be dangerous for when you're running a country. Because you could start some stuff that you could not stop. If you bring too many new ideas of liberty. What is that? It can be. I mean, talk to the British about it.
Yeah.
They had some issues in America regarding that, and we're gonna go back to what we're saying about Voltaire and the Enlightenment. This king Frederick is a new type of king, is what we could call an enlightened king, and that to me is crucial to understanding the Enlightenment. These people are not for power to the people. That's not what they are. They want the heads of states to be reasonable people in the pure sense of the word. They want these people to be educated, to be scientific, and to reason. They don't want them to be ordained by God. Lots of them, including Voltaire, not all of them, but most of them are atheists. Not even
No.
deists. Often they are atheists. Um, and they,
Frederick the Great was actually extremely anti-religious. I have a quote that he specifically said that Christianity is an old metaphysical fiction full of miracles, contradictions, and absurdities. Originally came from fervid imaginations from peoples of the Near East and spread into our Europe, where enthusiasts proclaimed this message and ambitious schemers pretended to be convinced by it, and only fools actually believed it to be true. So that was the sheer hatred
yeah.
that Frederick had for superstitious Christianity, which people actually believed in, like miracles and magic at the time too.
Yeah, it was very common. I mean, like for example, the French king was what we call, I don't know the English word, but the French word is thaumaturge. He was supposed to be able to heal you, just by touching you. And he actually would do it. He would go like
Yeah.
see sick people and touch them. It's a miracle they didn't all die from disease in a young age doing stuff like that. But those beliefs are so old, and they are the core of these countries. And it's not easy to get rid of. And when you actually rip the band-aid, well, that's called 1789 in France. It's when you rip that band-aid off, it's bloody.
Yeah. Famous podcaster Dan Carlin would essentially he'd call it an intellectual contagion.
Yeah.
Like as we all know, COVID with the mass pandemic. Once you start something, it spreads immediately.
Yeah, he used that analogy a lot for communism during the First World War, and he's absolutely right. To me, the Enlightenment is a very good example, because once you have this movement moving around in Europe, you have thinkers going around from country to country. Like you have Voltaire going in Prussia, you have Diderot writing to Catherine the Great in Russia. I mean, if you want to read Diderot's letters in his library, it's in Moscow. It's not in France. And that's where his works are, because of his link with her. And same thing, because she was kind of an enlightened monarch. She was a philosopher, and she would not share her rule with anybody. She was a dictator, no questions asked. But she wanted to use her brain about it, not just want to get rid of this guy or that guy, that country, this country. No, she did use her brain and improved the country on many levels, just like Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great was not a democrat; he was a dictator, but he was one, because at the time that's just the way power went. But he was one that actually wanted to use his brains to do it, and I think he had a goal. He wanted to better his country, and to move into a new age, if you will. I don't know how conscious he was of that, because it's hard
Frederick the Great, he is kind of a proto-Napoleon, if you consider that figure.
Mhm.
He invades a country. He invades Austria, specifically in 1740, Silesia, and that sets off this whole shockwave throughout Europe. And short story, Prussia manages to hold on to Silesia.
Mhm.
And the difference between Frederick the Great and Napoleon was that Frederick was actually able to live for 20 years in a practically almost peaceful country. He was able to develop his ruined population after the 7 Years' War, and something that Napoleon never had the chance to do because he was thrown out of power.
Yeah, it's something that I recall when we were studying the European history, the defeat of Napoleon, and especially the Treaty of Vienna in 1815. That's, for benefit of the listeners, that's the treaty after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. It was in discussion actually before Waterloo, but got interrupted because Napoleon came back to power. Then he's defeated at Waterloo. We go back at the Congress of Vienna, and we basically established Europe after the French Revolution. So France goes back to its borders from 1789. We put the king back in place. We do this, we do that, and here's the new world order. And we called it in class the triumph of conservative Europe, because that way of looking at things is the old way, the Ancien Régime way, because they'd won at Waterloo. But the seeds of the French Revolution ideas was there. I mean, then you're going to have revolutions in 1830, 1848, all over the place. It took a generation more, but because Napoleon brought these ideas with guns, you know. Here's the new way of looking at it. I'm not sure. Okay, you're dead. Boom. Next. It's not the best way to convince somebody.
For freedom with guns.
Exactly. It's he's not the first one to do it, and it was not the last.
Not at all.
It was not the last. Sadly enough, we still have people thinking that way. But to be fair about him, he was quite efficient at propagating those ideas, but he had this century before him of thinkers with tons of writings. You look at a project like the Encyclopédie, the first encyclopedia written in France in the mid 18th century, which was illegal, by the way. Having all this, the idea was to have the sum of all human knowledge in a series of books and to sell those books. It's considered one of the first capitalist enterprises, actually, because you would pay before you get the books. You would pay for it, they would produce it and ship it to you. It's Amazon. and at the time it was novel. You paying for something that is not there, like, what the heck? Who does that? But they were basically supporting these guys to produce these books. And you have all these D'Alembert, Diderot, even Voltaire did a few articles in the Encyclopédie. So to go back to our two guys. So you have Voltaire at the Berlin court with Frederick. How did these two got along? I mean, because it's one thing to be a fan of the guy. It's another thing to have him at your court, I assume.
So one thing I would say to that is don't meet your heroes. So it started out, they were throwing compliments at each other. It was a compliment sandwich, as my professor would love to say. And they just got along famously. Until there was, so Frederick the Great's court, full of intellectuals, full of philosophers, and basically to help Prussia become prestigious. Anyway, but there was a conflict between two of the main Frederick's philosophers in court. And Voltaire took one side and Frederick took the other side. So with that conflict is basically the beginning of the end. Voltaire only lived in Berlin for 3 years because of that. And interesting thing, though, when Voltaire left, he took one of Frederick's poems about the ruling heads of Europe that were a little bit too honest about how he didn't really like any of them. And Voltaire was on his way to Frankfurt, which was outside of Prussia's jurisdiction, free city of the Holy Roman Empire. And Frederick took some soldiers, illegally arrested Voltaire, and searched him for those poems. And because of that, they ended up going on a huge feud. Voltaire actually exposed Frederick's homosexuality to Europe in an article, basically saying how he was this debaucherous man who wasn't straight. And overall, they ended up becoming, in the end, they ended up forgiving each other, which is actually refreshing to see.
Yeah. Because, you didn't want to be on the bad side of Voltaire, because he was, he was so good at talking, and he was a quick spirit. I can give you a small example. He had a feud with a Frenchman named Jean Fréron. and basically exchanging letters. And in the Parisian salon, the Parisian salons were the place where those intellectuals met and discussed and discovered new ideas and stuff. So it's actually a huge part of the Enlightenment. And this guy and Voltaire, they just hate each other like you have no idea. And Fréron would do anything he could to lower Voltaire's perspective everywhere he went. And one day Voltaire had enough. So he published a small, very small poem. And if I translate it liberally, it says, "The other way, at the bottom of a valley, a snake bit Jean Fréron. What do you think happened? The snake died." I'm translating, but it gives you an idea. I mean, what do you do against a guy who can answer you like that? He had that spirit and that that way of thinking that you can't win.
He is an absolutely literary genius.
Yes, I mean, if you read I'm a big fan of his philosophical accounts, like Candide or L'Ingénu, books like this, because they tell you a cute story, but it's actually a way of showing you the horrible truth about what's happening in your own country. Candide is a huge he's criticizing the government from top to bottom and religion. He also has the one called Microméga. I don't know if you know about that one, Micromégas, maybe in English. It's a science fiction novel in the 18th century. He has one guy from Jupiter, one guy from Saturn, I think, and they come to Earth, and they basically, it's what we call the new eye perspective. Somebody that is from some other place, they come here and they see the country or Earth that is as it is, and of course they talk liberally about it. And you can imagine that this discussion is not exactly kind to what they're saying. And Voltaire would say, "It's not me, it's the character. It's this guy from Saturn is saying this and that. That's not me." So it's a common tactic, and they all did it. But Voltaire did it with lots of charm. Is such an. I mean, I don't know how well it translates, but I know that in French it's so easy to read and so nicely. And it's often short stories. You can just go around. It's very enjoyable to read. And then you have his plays, obviously, which are quite good too. Even they're not often played these days. We like to play Molière more. He's funnier. So, from what I understand, so he goes back to. I think he went to Switzerland before going back to France. He didn't go back to France directly, because I know that in total, like in that period of his life, I think Voltaire did not live in France for like over 20 years. Because he lived a long time. Voltaire lived a very long time. And he came back to France at the end of his life, and he was greeted as a hero in Paris. Like he had to be gone away for years to realize they missed him. So what can you tell us about the consequences of that period of time when Voltaire was at the Prussian court? How did I understand that they were in a feud at the end and they reconciled, but still, what was the impact on Frederick and maybe his rule in Prussia?
So the overall impact, I would say, is Frederick managed to piss off the wrong guy, which obviously drama, and he also managed to create something that, as he grew older, would grow more and more. He became more jaded. He became a stubborn curmudgeon that not necessarily was open to new change. As a young man, Frederick believed that change was necessary in Europe, and if one does not advance, one retreats. But as he grew older, he became more stubborn. Frederick became less willing to accept change. And specifically, that had a bad effect towards German literature. See, German literature was going through a renaissance with people like Lessing, Goethe, and other extremely important authors at that time. But Frederick never cared for him. He only liked he was essentially a neoclassicist. He believed that the old ideas of statecraft, specifically from Julius Caesar's time, was the best way to do it. And new ideas, honestly, probably scared him.
I guess we're all victim of that at some point in our life. You know, we get older. It's like, you know, I like the way I do stuff. I just keep going that way. I understand it can be hard to reinvent oneself. You know, at over 50 years of age. You know, it's not no easy task. But it's still impressive, you know, that you have this monarch from that, you could say, second-rate power, that is willing to take risks, that is willing to improve or augment the importance of his country in Europe. And, you know, competition is fierce. And he still adopted those ideas. And and from what I understand, he not only adopted them, but he reflected on them.
Oh, absolutely. Voltaire actually, in 1740, he published anonymously Frederick the Great's work, The Anti-Machiavel. This was essentially saying that Machiavelli's The Prince was wrong. But even though saying the backstabbing nature of Machiavelli was wrong, he still ends up invading all these countries basically illegally. And especially Saxony during the Seven Years' War. But no, I would say that one of Frederick's biggest failures as a monarch was to support, was the lack of support of German literature. Frederick never fully got rid of feudalism in Prussia either. He lightened the rules in Silesia, the province he conquered, but in Prussia, he never fully got rid of feudalism. It took Napoleon in 1806 to smash Prussia in order to abolish feudalism.
Frederick was born king, but he was born king in not an easy kingdom to rule and not an easy situation to manage. And he did absorb those ideas of the Enlightenment in a way that not many monarchs did. So we have to give him credit for that. You know, when you look at the French monarch, they rejected this completely.
Yep.
They didn't want Louis XV and Louis XVI. They didn't care for those ideas because they recognized how dangerous they could be.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think is interesting is that Frederick used the Enlightenment to help his army. He used his army as a machine. One part is replaceable by another part, and it works as a culmination of a machine together. And by creating this machine of an army, he basically is untouchable. He allows more free speech because he has that army. He knows that his population isn't going to revolt because he has the best trained army on earth. So the fact that he had that confidence that Frederick the Great was an untouchable man due to his army, he allowed more freedom of speech. But he did not, again, he was not pro-democracy. He was an autocrat to his core. He just believed in efficiency. One thing that I found interesting is that I recently read from Tim Blanning's book about Frederick the Great that there were book burnings, that Frederick the Great burned a few books of the major philosophers at the time. I think Jean-Jacques Rousseau, possibly.
Because Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the one more focused on the social and political. I would say Voltaire is more on Voltaire is on the society as a whole and on the moral implications, if you will, and on religion a lot. Rousseau wrote the Contrat Social, you know,
the social contract.
Yeah, so he's more on, and that's just a fantastic read. When you read that in hindsight, you're like, he figured it out completely. He was a good analyzer. He could see it coming, and was not the only one. You know, when you read stuff written by some of the encyclopedists, also these guys knew what was going on. But it's still fascinating to see how it went with those leaders and the differences and the contradictions. The contradictions are so huge. Do as I say, not as I do is really that for them, and we've talked a lot.
Oh my
What should have
goodness.
been, part of, I think what should have been part of a show will be the show, but that's fine. It's a special thing and it's nice. So before we stop, where can people find you, Alec?
So look up The Life and Times of Frederick the Great. If you just look up Frederick the Great podcast on Google, I'll basically be the second or first person you'll show up. So I'll be on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, basically all the major podcast platforms. But yeah, make sure you give this one a listen because, hey, you do a great job.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Alec. It's been a pleasure. And I hope to talk to you again soon. Au revoir.
Yeah, I love it.
I hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I have. It was fantastic to have Alec on the show to discuss Voltaire, Frederick, and the Enlightenment. Be sure to check his podcast. It's really great. I will leave links in the show notes. That's all for today. Thank you for listening. Au revoir. You can find the Lafayette We Are Here podcast on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, and other platforms, or on LafayettePodcast.com. If you wish to contact me, you can do so at Emmanuel@LafayettePodcast.com or on Twitter @LafayettePod. The music for this podcast is the Marche pour la cérémonie des Turcs, composed by Jean-Baptiste Lully, arranged and performed by Jérôme Arfouche.